I was at NYU Law a few years ago from 2015 to 2017 as assistant director of JD admissions. And prior to that, I did read files for Harvard Law School JD admissions program. But in my experience with NYU, certainly, there was attention to test scores for sure and grades, but, a good personal statement went a long way. Really knowing why you wanted to go to law school also went a long way. But, there's a number of soft factors that go into it as well, in terms of recruiting a diverse class that's representative of the country and the world. Certainly we'd look to round out, sometimes there are non-traditional applicants or students who had a particular niche interest in a particular area of law.
Well, that's great. So you're saying the soft factors do matter, of course. It's not just the LSAT score and the GPA. What are some things you typically see among strong applicants in terms of their personal statements or diversity statements, addenda? What stands out to you?
Sure. So, I'll start first with the personal statement because that is, essentially the most important part of the application besides the LSAT and the GPA. But at the end of the day, the personal statement should really be a reflection of who you are. What I would always tell applicants or prospective students is that it should sound like you. So it doesn't have to be a particularly flowery language, but, it should be a little bit more formal. And it should highlight, an experience or two that you feel is really essential to your story so far. So, a lot of law schools limit the personal statement to 2 or 3 pages, which is pretty typical. So in that time, it might be good to tell a couple anecdotes. Sometimes people would talk certainly about their backgrounds. Sometimes they would talk about what their future would look like or some sort of essential story. And at the end of the day, when I read files, there were so many different stories. And that's what I really took from it. You're not going to sound like someone else. I know this is one of the most intimidating parts of the process. But at the end of the day, have someone look it over and say whether it sounds like you as a person and whether it gets across why law school makes sense at this point in time for you.
No, that's great advice. Definitely having people read it over. What are some common pitfalls you see when it comes to the personal statement? I mean, one thing I can think of, you said 2 to 3 pages. Do you ever see some that are a little bit too long sometimes?
Occasionally, yeah. So, I think a lot of law schools actually have pretty strict requirements, whether it's font size or length. But usually we wouldn't get one that was terribly long. So occasionally it would be too long. But I think the pitfalls that students would occasionally run into, obviously spelling, grammar are major ones. Essentially, sometimes students would mention a different law school and they meant to submit that partial statement to a different law school. So that's definitely a red flag, if you haven't read your personal statement carefully. I think in other cases, sometimes they're focusing too much on maybe their parent or somebody else in their life. It's a personal statement, so certainly you can highlight influential figures, but I think at the end of the day, it should focus on yourself. So, certainly if your father or your, grandmother was a lawyer and that influenced you, that can be a little bit of a part of it, but it should essentially be focused on you. You're the one applying.
Right. Naturally, that makes a lot of sense. So I understand you work with students privately now. You can obviously change any of the details, but I'm wondering, are there any particularly amazing essays you've seen or particularly terrible essays you've seen either in your work when you were at NYU Law or now that you're going private?
Sure. So, obviously, due to anonymity, we have to change some details here. But I think occasionally, if a tragedy happened in a student's life, that can certainly be a very, poignant essay. But you just have to be really careful about tone or the amount of details. So certainly, there have been applicants who've gone through some really terrible things. And so I think the focus should be how you got through it and how you worked through such a difficult situation, but not so much on like gratuitous detail. And then focusing on how this experience has, made you feel like law school is the next step in your life.